This is our 2 o'clock session with Adam Lee. He is a writer for The Guardian, and he writes his own blog called Daylight Atheism, and he writes for AlterNet and all this other cool stuff. He actually covered the Secular Student Alliance back in March after the launch of our mission, vision, and values in The Guardian. So if you read that, it was pretty cool. Got a lot of shares. Got our name out there, which is really exciting. Adam's also just like the nicest guy ever. He's on our speakers bureau. I could tell you nice things about Adam all day. I think he's like one of the greatest people on our speakers bureau. Yeah, you're great. And he's going to be talking to us about the coming secular era. So put your hands together for Adam. Yay!
Thank you, Kelly. I'll try to live up to that. All right. The most important changes don't come in the form of attention-grabbing headlines, but subtle trends that quietly gather momentum until, by the time they finally burst into public view, they're unstoppable. Such is the case with the most important and paradoxically most underappreciated trend in American religion today: the long-term, across-the-board decline of Christianity and the corresponding rise of atheism, which has been going on behind the scenes for decades and is now well underway. Given the political and cultural influence of the Christian right, this may seem hard to believe. Politicians regularly seek out prominent evangelical pastors to kiss their rings, such as when both President Obama and John McCain appeared for a presidential debate at Rick Warren's Saddleback Church in 2008. The largest megachurch in the country, Joel Osteen's Lakewood Church in Houston, is built in an arena that formerly housed the Houston Rockets and has a weekly attendance of 43,000. T.D. Jakes, who delivered a morning service at President Obama's inauguration ceremony, runs the Potter's House, a 30,000-member Pentecostal megachurch in Dallas. The Southeast Christian megachurch in Louisville, Kentucky, has a 100-acre campus with 8 parking lots, 4 basketball courts, a fitness center with an indoor track, and a 7.5-story sanctuary. Some of these megachurches are so large that they've been nicknamed Six Flags Over Jesus. But the numbers don't lie, and survey after survey shows that the megachurches, as intimidating as they seem, represent consolidation, not growth. The undeniable fact is that, as a percentage of the whole U.S. population, Christianity is declining and has been for decades. The first rumblings of this change came in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The 2001 American Religious Identification Survey, a nationwide poll of over 50,000 households, reported the startling news that 14% of the population, or in other words, about 1 in 6 Americans, or 30 million people, claimed to have no religion. That was almost double the number who said the same just 10 years earlier. And in the years since, that demographic shift has not only continued, it's accelerated. Sometime in 2012, with little fanfare, the country crossed a milestone. For the first time in its history, America was no longer a majority Protestant country. And the trend is still speeding up. A huge new survey released this year by the Pew Research Center found that as of 2014, 23% of Americans consider themselves non-religious, an all-time high. Put another way, there are now more non-religious Americans than there are Roman Catholics or Southern Baptists or all members of the mainline Protestant churches combined. The non-religious can be found in large numbers in every state, from the liberal coasts to the ultra-conservative Bible Belt. And according to a study by the Barna Group, religious skeptics are also becoming more diverse, defying the atheist as nerdy white guy stereotype and attracting significant numbers of women and people of color. Barna found that the percent of women who identify as atheists has tripled in the last 20 years, and concluded that, in many ways, the non-religious resemble the rest of America more than we once did, and that our numbers are gaining more quickly than anyone thought possible in the last 20 years. Granted, not all non-religious people, or none of the abovers, are atheists or agnostics. Some are deists, New Age believers, or quote-unquote spiritual people who simply choose not to formally identify with any church. But many of them aren't. The 2008 edition of the American Religious Identification Survey found that about 12% of Americans are atheists, professing no belief in a higher power, regardless of whether they choose to use the A word to identify themselves. And that number, too, has been rising in recent years. Much of the credit for this dramatic demographic shift goes to the millennial generation, usually defined as people born between 1982 and 2000. The millennials are ethnically diverse, politically progressive, and the least religious generation in American history. A 2012 Pew survey found that 1/3 of millennials are unaffiliated with any religion. What's more, while most older generations' belief in God has remained steady throughout their lives, the millennials are apparently getting less religious as they get older, something that's unprecedented in American history. And one more thing you may not know is how big the millennial generation is. It amounts to 78 million people, which is more than the baby boomers. By 2020, the millennials will represent about 40% of all American voters. As America becomes less religious, the churches are feeling the pinch. The mainline Protestant churches, once the dominant cultural power in the United States, have dwindled to shadows of their former selves and are well on their way to extinction. The largest Christian denominations remaining, including Roman Catholicism and Southern Baptism, are stagnant or shrinking and struggling to come up with ways to reverse the decline. Catholicism in particular is facing a demographic crisis as its priests age with not nearly enough new recruits to replace them, forcing the church to sell off land and close or consolidate parishes. In many places, regular attendance at Mass is as low as 12 to 15% of self-identified Catholics. Along the same lines, the Southern Baptist Convention estimates that 70% of all its churches have stagnant or declining membership, and that if this trend continues, half of existing churches will be forced to close their doors by 2030. Meanwhile, groups like the Secular Student Alliance are booming, far outpacing religious groups like Campus Crusade for Christ that spend far more money on advertising. The trend is so noticeable that even major Christian apologists like Lee Strobel are noticing it. Strobel said, "We are facing a crisis in America. Skepticism is rising. Too many young people are leaving the faith." I wouldn't call it a crisis, but the point is clear. What's driving this change? Part of the answer is rising education levels, which correlate with decreasing levels of religious belief. Another part is the growth of multiculturalism and the increased ease of communication, especially facilitated by the internet. When your own religion is the only one you know of, it's easy to view it as part of the immutable order of things, just part of what everyone knows to be true. But when you come into contact with atheists, or even with other religious people who believe differently, you can see it for what it is, a mere hypothesis about the world, just one proposed explanation among many. Using the internet, a believer can see all the best arguments against religion made through the ages simply by typing a few words into a search engine. Or they can safely and privately share any doubts they may have with others who feel the same. Or they can see religion parodied and mocked in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Part of the answer, too, is the rise of the atheist movement, which has made the case that you don't need religion to live a happy, meaningful life or to be a moral person. Even though atheists are still a minority, that message also travels beyond the boundaries of our community and resonates to some degree, even among people who don't explicitly call themselves atheist or agnostic. After all, when you see out-of-the-closet atheists happy and thriving, how can you not conclude that religion may not be as necessary for a good life as you might once have thought? But I think the biggest part of the answer is that the world has made moral progress while the churches haven't. They're clinging to cruel and archaic views, like demands for women's subordination and intolerance of LGBT rights, makes them seem like relics, outposts of prejudice that people increasingly reject. A 2007 study by the Barna Group, which is a Christian polling firm, by the way, found that just 16% of non-Christians in their late teens and 20s have a, quote, good impression of Christianity. They call it judgmental, hypocritical, and too involved in politics. In that same survey, 91% of young non-Christians said Anti-homosexual describes Christianity better than any other term. I can't imagine where they could have gotten that idea. And having gotten themselves into this hole, the solution that religious leaders most commonly propose is to dig deeper, doubling down on the same rules, demanding that their members preach and proselytize more, insisting more loudly that everyone show up for a sermon each week. Little do they realize that if widespread rejection of their ideas is the problem, then working harder to spread their message is going to make that problem worse, not better. Others propose tinkering around the edges by using more social media, playing better music, or redecorating their churches. Of course, they inevitably come into conflict with others who insist that they just need to be less modern and more traditional. Still, other faiths are going to extreme lengths to isolate their members from the outside world, like the ultra-Orthodox Jews who rented out an entire baseball stadium to lecture their men about the dangers of the internet, or the evangelical Christian push toward homeschooling and withdrawal from the outside world, or the Muslim groups who march to demand that the web be censored of any idea that offends them. All these plans are attempts to ignore the elephant in the room. It's not that the churches don't preach hard enough, or that they don't tweet or Facebook their sermons. It's that their ideas are unpopular. For example, a 2009 Pew study found that 2/3 of self-identified former Catholics said they left the church because they disagreed with its teachings. The rare clergy members who've actually asked people why they're leaving and listened to the answers have found the same thing. Yet, not one of the religious leaders that I've heard of have proposed actually changing any of their doctrines, even when surveys overwhelmingly show that that's people's biggest objection. Their lack of introspection and their institutional resistance to self-correction, the same qualities that got them into this trouble, are now making it almost impossible for them to change course and pull out of it. The coming secular era is visible in more than just surveys. You can see it in religion's declining political influence in the Western world. In social trends they tried to stop and couldn't, especially same-sex marriage. You can see it in the clergy who are growing old and dwindling with no younger recruits to replace them, and in the abandoned churches being converted to serve other uses. Here's an example from Edinburgh, Scotland, of some pictures that I took. These are all disused Christian churches that have been converted into restaurants and bars and nightclubs. This church in Canada was converted into a recording studio. The band Arcade Fire recorded 2 albums here. And this is my very favorite example, a church in Quebec that was turned into a library. You can also see this in countries where openly secular people are serving in elected office, and where voters say, you don't need religion to be a good person. Compared to other Western countries, America is behind the curve in many of these things, but we're catching up faster than you might think. The natural question is whether religion will disappear entirely, and my answer is that I don't think so, at least not any time in the foreseeable future. I suspect there's a core of believers who will hang on long after most other people have either given up on faith or turned it into a harmless hobby. And in the developing world especially, religion still exerts far more political and cultural influence, although I do believe that eventually those countries will follow the same secularization curve. But what we can expect is that in the coming secular era, religion will no longer be a major political or cultural force. Politicians won't pander to faith or thump the Bible as an electoral strategy. People will make moral decisions by reasoning together rather than by consulting holy books. The hierarchies of oppression that have been propped up by dogma for so long will crumble as people rise up to demand equality. Make no mistake, there will still be moral controversies, differing political opinions, and hard-fought debates. Even the complete disappearance of religion, which I don't expect, wouldn't mean the end of human conflict, irrationality, or prejudice. But even the diminishing of religion would eliminate one of the major forces opposing moral progress. I also predict that as the churches dwindle and fade, secular groups will arise to fulfill the human need for community and connection that religion currently supplies. We can throw out the prayers, sacred texts, harmful dogmas, unaccountable clergy, and magical and superstitious beliefs, and keep the parts of religion that are worth keeping, namely communities that help people come together, support each other in times of need, and celebrate the joy and the possibility of life. These don't have to look or feel anything like traditional churches. I can imagine humanist groups meeting at night under the open sky to stargaze and learn about the vastness and the majesty of the cosmos of which we are a part. Or that would devote one day a week to nature walks and hikes, teaching people to appreciate the beauty of the living world and the magnificently complex web of ecosystems that sustain us. If there were sermons, they'd be drawn not from one ancient book of myths, but from the writings of great men and women throughout history and from every culture, philosophers, poets, and scientists. If there were tithes and collections, they wouldn't go to prop up an already wealthy and unaccountable church hierarchy, but to aid worthy causes in the community and beyond. And I can imagine secular ceremonies to mark life milestones like weddings, childbirths, graduations, and funerals. Again, not to invest these events with supernatural meaning, but merely to recognize that they have human meaning. This new secular community isn't just a distant fantasy. We can already see it emerging in groups like Sunday Assembly, Camp Quest, Foundation Beyond Belief, and of course the Secular Student Alliance. All these organizations do more than just traditional forms of atheist activism. They devote themselves to making it possible to live a happy, fulfilling, and purposeful life as a non-believer, together in community with others who think the same. Of course, even in the most optimistic scenarios of our future growth, atheists are still a minority of the population and will be for many years to come. We won't be winning elections single-handedly anytime soon. But if we don't set our expectations unrealistically high, a growing and engaged atheist movement can accomplish a lot of worthwhile things. Fighting back against prejudice, spreading our ideas into the broader cultural discussion, boosting the legitimacy of reason and secularism, and weakening the pull of superstition and fundamentalism. Even if our numbers are still small in absolute terms, we are already far larger than many other groups that politicians would not dare denigrate for electoral gain. And one thing I am confident about is that our greatest successes still lie ahead of us. To the brash religious evangelists and the unduly pessimistic atheists who argue that religion is too entrenched to ever be dislodged, I say just wait and see. Although individual human beings can be fiercely irrational and dogmatic, humanity as a whole is capable of rising up and overthrowing old opinions with amazing suddenness when the time is right. After all, even the last 100 years have seen several dramatic revolutions of opinion, and prejudices that once seemed graven in stone have crumbled in the space of a single lifetime. I don't claim to know exactly when or how the secular era will arrive, or what it will look like, but I'm confident that it is coming, and that generations to come will witness a transformation of the world as unimaginable as the changes that we've witnessed would have been to those who came before us. Thank you.